my pleasure to introduce Quinn. In a minute, Quinn will lead off with a 45-minute presentation of his dissertation on enhanced rock weathering. And so this is a strategy to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to hopefully help stabilize climate. You'll hear more from Quinn about that in a second, but I'll say that I believe that Quinn's work provides some important and new insights into the co-benefits and risks associated with enhanced weathering that I think have been overlooked so far. This is a challenging project, a field project, and it required months and months of careful planning on Quinn's part, a lot of field work and laboratory analysis, and to collect a pretty novel data set. And that was followed by a very concerted effort to make the most of that data set through some thoughtful reflection and analysis. Quinn's efforts have started to pay off. He's got one paper that's been accepted for publication. He's got another in review from his dissertation, and at least another in the pipeline. And so I anticipate that this work, his findings, will have sort of pertinent implications and will be of interest to a wide variety of scientists and practitioners who are galvanized by carbon capture methods. So, Quinn, over to you.
Okay. Good morning, Yale, or good afternoon, Yale University and our guests. I'm pleased to present the findings from my dissertation. It's been 5 years. It's entitled Enhanced Rock Weathering Across a Summit-to-Riparian Continuum in a Temperate Agricultural Watershed. Enhanced rock weathering, or simply enhanced weathering, is the notion that we can accelerate the silicate weathering reaction that captures carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that normally takes many thousands of years, but we want to speed that up by orders of magnitude through crushing the silicate rock, increasing the surface area, and spreading out the resulting fines over agricultural land. You see, in nature, silicate weathering cools the Earth's climate and creates new soil. This is known as pedogenesis. Silicate dissolution releases base cations. So these base cations are positively charged ions within the aqueous solution, including ones like calcium, magnesium. These are divalent base cations, and then monovalent base cations, including potassium and sodium. In the process, it also generates bicarbonate alkalinity. So HCO3-, this is a form of inorganic carbon and the means by which enhanced rock weathering sequesters carbon dioxide. However, it is imperative that these weathering products will move through the ecosystem and out of the watershed to the ocean for long-term storage. On the right, you will see a photomicrograph of Pioneer Valley basalt from within section. You will see several different minerals, including cerussite, actinolite, plagioclase. These minerals will dissolve in soils once they're crushed and they make contact with soil acids, particularly carbonic acid. Now, adding rock powders to soil is not completely new. It has been done in an agricultural sense for a very long time. In fact, actually some work extends back to a German scientist named Julius Hensel. He published a bread from stones in 1894 with the proposition of using basalt rock as a soil amendment, and this was within the wake of the advent of industrial fertilizers. Now, for those of you that don't know, basalt is the most common rock type in Earth's crust. Other early work was done by Hilf in 1937 that used basalt rock powder on tree saplings. Soil fertility has the potential to be a primary benefit or even co-driver of enhanced rock weathering. It reduces soil acidity and this increases pH. That increase in pH actually has the ability to improve soil fertility by improving plant nutrient availability. Now, the rock can also release some amount of elements that can even fertilize the plants, like phosphorus or magnesium. In some cases, we can even see increases in agronomic yield as well as crop quality as a result. Now, if durable CDR requires weathering products to travel to the ocean for long-term carbon storage, we need to expand our view beyond a simple soil rock model. We need to understand the fate of these products at the watershed scale. And I would argue that an experimental framework that spans the hill slope summit to the downstream riparian zone is one of the most appropriate ways to do that. These hill slopes have structure, and these structures can be used as analogs for whole watershed scale processes. These watershed scale processes can actually be seen over entire continental scales, think the Mississippi River, but we can test them right on an individual hill slope. A typical hill slope structure has a nomenclature that follows that of a human profile, starting with the summit, shoulder, back, foot, and toe, and then eventually leading down to a riparian zone near the stream. Upslope soils tend to be systematically different from downslope soils. For example, pit A, you can see, is much more oxidized with several oxidized layers, whereas pit B is much wetter and more reduced. So weathering products will not only move vertically down the soil profile, but also laterally down to the stream. The riparian zone is a critical landscape feature on any given watershed. However, it is seldom discussed within enhanced rock weathering literature. A riparian zone is a near-stream area with soils that are influenced by shallow groundwater, they're hydrologically connected to uplands, and they are a high-contact zone for water and solutes. They are a key bottleneck within the watershed from upslope soils to downslope riverine chemistry and hydrology. This matters in context of enhanced rock weathering because they have the potential to intercept ERW-derived solutes from the upslope soils, and they can potentially control the storage, transformation, and timing of export. They could potentially amplify or delay the ERW signal. They are, in fact, reactive interfaces. Another consideration is that many of these feedstocks used in enhanced rock weathering have heavy metals, particularly chromium and nickel. If you look at the figure on the right, you will see maximum CDR potential of some feedstocks and nickel content. Generally, some feedstocks, like ultramafic feedstocks, tend to occupy the upper bounds of both distributions. In soil, however, environmental risk depends not simply on the total metal content, but on metallability and mobility. Will plants take up this metal? Will the metals leach into groundwater? In other words, are these metals structurally bound within minerals, or are they environmentally accessible? During weathering, there are two countervailing processes that occur. There is the liberation of metals from the rock, generally in a cationic form. For example, you may have copper 2 or potentially aluminum 3, but at the same time, immobilization can happen through increased pH and also adsorption and potential secondary mineral formations like aluminum hydroxide. And finally, there are connected flow paths that redistribute these released metals and immobilizing products. This motivated three key questions that became the architecture of my dissertation. Chapter 2, how does the salt affect soil fertility across hill slope position and land use? Chapter 3, does the chemistry of riparian soil and shallow groundwater pools signal lateral transport of weathering products. Chapter 4, does enhanced rock weathering alter metal reliability in agricultural and riparian soils? To answer these questions, we created a watershed scale experiment with a sampling design spanning the continuum from hill slope summit to riparian soils. So, in 2021, the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture funded this experiment at the Sleepers River Experimental Watershed in Vermont, a USGS research watershed with records extending back to its establishment in 1959. Within Sub-Watershed 2, or simply W2, we applied 20 tons of crushed basalt rock across the landscape. This was a comprehensive watershed study with colleagues of mine that studied both stream water chemistry and conducted reactive transport modeling. This dissertation focuses specifically on the terrestrial continuum between agricultural and riparian soils. I want to show you a 3D watershed model from drone photogrammetry at our site. And so what you will see is that this is our overarching watershed. But within that, we have this agricultural ecosystem, an agro-ecosystem. And so we have a stream that runs down the middle, and see this wood thicketed area? So that is a fenced-in riparian zone. As you move up the slopes on both sides of this valley, you will hit pasture, and then on the summits, you will hit hayfield. And so we have this mosaic of both land use and topology. This is a working dairy, and so we will deal with logistics of cows moving between paddocks within the lower fields. But we applied 20 tons of crushed rock across the entire fields except for 4 designated exclusion zones. These black dashed lines represent areas of 30 meters in width that where no basalt was applied. And this runs up hill slope gradient. And we did it here, 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 and here. We also had 8 sampling transects that we'll get to in a minute. But I want to show you that this is a region where we can have a model hill slope with both a summit, shoulder, foot, and toe. Summit and shoulder do exist perfectly collinearly with the hayfield, and foot and toe are perfectly collinear with pasture. So, we sourced our finds from the John S. Lane and Son Quarry in western Massachusetts. And that's on the left. On the right, you can see the finds being spread across the field with a top-dressing tractor that mounted on, a top-dressing spreader mounted on a tractor. Now, let's move into chapter 2. How does basalt affect soil fertility across hill slope position and land use? Let's describe a little bit more about our sampling design. We had 8 sampling transects. 1, 4, 5, and 7 were our controls. 2, 3, 6, 8 were our treatments. Now we had 8 sampling plots along each transect. Remember, these transects move directly up hill slope gradient. So positions 1 and 2 in red Roman numerals, we called that the pasture toe. Roman numerals 3 and 4, we called that the pasture foot. 5 and 6, we called the hayfield shoulder. And 7 and 8, we called the hayfield summit. Now you'll notice a few other things on this map. The dark blue line represents the delineation of the watershed, which comes from a water gauging station downstream. The bright blue line is the stream within our central riparian corridor. And you will see both the western hayfield, western pasture, and eastern hayfield. Now, we were interested in the topsoil. So we said 0 to 15 centimeters, about 6 inches, actually exactly. We used 1.59 centimeter cores. We had 8 cores per sample. And we one sample per plot. There were 64 plots in general with 32 control and 32 treatment. Now, we had 1 year of baseline monitoring and 2 years of post-application monitoring. Within the baseline period, we had 2 sampling campaigns, including fall 2022 and spring 2023. We applied during the summer of 2023, and we had 4 post-application periods, including fall 2023, spring 2024, fall 2024, and spring 2025. We had our soil samples were field homogenized, they were kept cool on ice, they were air dried at room temperature for 2 weeks until constant mass and sieved through 2 millimeter sieve. Now, the total effort of soil sampling was 3,072 soil cores within our agricultural soils. Is there anything else I want to say here? I don't think so. Now, for our chemical analyses, we used the standard soil test from the University of Maine. This was the same soil test that was used by the tenant farmer. And to the right, you will see a historic W2 soil test that was actually paid for and used by the previous tenant farmer several years prior to our investigation. Soil pH was measured with a 1-to-1 soil-to-water slurry. A modified Morgan extractant, including ammonium acetate and acetic acid, which was buffered to a pH of 4.8, was used to extract nutrients. Now, we wanted to look at 4 key essential nutrients that could potentially be released from the salt, including calcium, magnesium, and potassium. That was measured on an ICP OES, and phosphorus was measured colorimetrically. We wanted to know the ability of the soil to hold nutrients at field pH. And we were also interested in the soil's ability to hold base cations within the exchange complex. So there is this measurement called the effective cation exchange capacity, and it is a sum of the base cations at field pH of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, as well as exchangeable acidity. Now, exchangeable acidity was measured when pH dropped below 6 using a Malick buffer test. An interesting side note is that the Morgan extractant was actually the first accepted soil fertility test in the world and was invented right here in New Haven at the Agricultural Extension Agency about 0.7 miles from here back in 1939. So, to model our data, we use something called a linear mixed effects model with plot level random intercepts. Now, this was used in order to model the heterogeneity within our field. Remember, we had a lot of different forces that could change the background chemistry, including cows that would rotate between lower pasture, and so on and so forth. Now, because of this, we also had separate models for both hayfield and pasture. The variant structure was quite different from the pasture versus the hayfield because of increased heterogeneity given the cows rotating, and something called the hotspot effect, when cows would have manure in certain spots that would create more nitrification, and then acidification. So in order to capture all this pre-existing complexity, we created our model that captured both hill soil position, treatment, application period, and campaign timing. Now, we tested our fixed effects with something called a walled test. And then for non-pH analytes, we natural log transformed and then back transformed in order to get the percent change. We used several model diagnostics, including residual plots, QQ plots, and variograms in order to assess the assumptions of linearity and homoscedasticity, as well as potential issues with autospatial correlation. Let's get into some of the data. We saw seasonal patterns in pH and extractable calcium that revealed a coherent patina pattern. I want to turn your attention to spring 2022 pH. Let's look at the total. We see a pH of around 6 that then falls to 5.8 at our foot. Now, this is both within the pasture. You'll notice that these tend to be systematically a little more acidic than the hayfield, which is the shoulder and summit. Now, the reason the foot is lower than the toe is because you may have some degree of base cation leaching within the middle of your hill slope, and then pooling of these base cations at the toe. Interestingly, if we look across seasons, you will see that pH in the shoulder and summit actually drop by a little bit. And then the pH within your toe increases by about 0.1, 0.2 units. And so we see this seasonally dynamic shifting around of our baseline chemistry. And we also see the same pattern with calcium, where we see that calcium sort of increases in the summer and fall, and then flushes from our upper slopes, and then pools within our toe. One thing you'll also notice is that pH tends to be a little more clustered within our hayfield as opposed to our pasture, and that is mostly due to more consistent land management like mowing and fertilizer application. On top of this, with our linear mixed effects model, our largest treatment effect for soil fertility was soil pH, and we saw that the largest changes happened in the middle positions of the hill slope, including the toe and the foot, with the largest change happening at the fall 2024 within the foot slope of the pasture, 0.24 units. We also saw changes in calcium, extractable calcium, with calcium becoming significantly different in fall 2023 within our mid-slopes. So, to put this all together, what we saw was the largest change we saw was soil pH. And so we did some thinking as to what might be modifying that treatment response. And turns out it was baseline soil pH and acidity. So we took the change in soil pH and we plotted it against initial acidity. And so when we started with around a pH of 7 and 6.5, we don't see much of a change in pH. And as we go lower, we start to see that this change in pH becomes greater. And then by a pH of 5.5, we're seeing pH changes of around 0.4, 0.5 units. And so you may say, well, is this just an artifact of the analog nature of pH? Well, we actually took it out of the analog and put it in terms of proton activity, change versus initial proton activity, and the relationship is even stronger. So what's going on here? What we believe to be happening is one of two things. Most likely, we are seeing a shift in sort of the mechanisms that at lower pH, there is more soil acidity that can be neutralized, and so therefore we see a larger change in pH. But at the same time, we may actually be seeing more dissolution of our feedstock because it's more acidic. These are intertwined, but they are slightly different, and we can't really resolve it from this data. But we do see that there is this effect happening, and this is the same effect that they saw at Hubbard Brook, that the most acidic parts of the hill slope tended to have the greatest treatment effect, almost like this smoothing effect across the landscape. And so what we found is that this was the baseline seasonal patina dynamics, where we have calcium that is sort of flushing through the system every year. So in spring, during snowmelt, we get this flushing from the upper slopes and then pooling in the lower slopes. And then pH sort of follows this. We see that pH is a little more consistent across our hayfield. So we sort of have this combination of both land use and hill slope driving baseline conditions. One thing to note is that this is the distance from the stream, and this is our hill slope. This is hayfield, this is pasture. On the right side, you will see how this actually modified the treatment, the interaction, if you will. Again, distance from the stream. So what we see is that calcium tends to respond more to land use as opposed to, tends to respond more to hill slope, whereas pH tends to respond more to both land use and hill slope. So we see that calcium was increasing mostly within the pasture foot and hayfield shoulder, and then within pH, we see, this is the change before minus after, by the way. We see that pH generally increased across most of the agricultural soils, but at the hayfield shoulder and pasture foot, we see the largest increases, and the largest increase was actually at the pasture foot, which was because on the landscape that was the most acidic initial condition. So where I think this gets interesting is where we start to compare our findings to that of other studies. So these are ours. So we had to, in order to find these treatment effects, we had to parse very carefully through the different landscape features that could potentially be confounding our results. But when we look at other temperate studies, a lot of times we find that they have actually no detectable treatment effects. Or if they do, they're very small. Or they apply at 5 times the rate, and then they start to see more meaningful changes in soil chemistry. So when we compare this to, so we had a well-buffered temperate soil. When we compare this to more acidic, nutrient-poor tropical soils, we start to see something interesting. At these agronomic rates of 20 tons per hectare, we start to see much larger increases in pH and extractable nutrients. Now that is interesting because it provides a practical implication. Perhaps within soils like the ones we have, well-buffered temperate soils, this may act mainly as a liming agent. But then in nutrient-poor tropical soils, this may act as both a liming agent and a multi-nutrient fertilizer. In fact, if we actually look at the continent of South America, and this is soil pH, you will see that soil acidity is actually greatest in more tropical countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. And as you move further south into southern Brazil, into the Pampas region, and then Argentina and Patagonia, soils systematically become more neutral and mildly alkaline. Though it's not perfect, there is a lot of different forces that change these gradients. So, to summarize these findings, land use and topography created a seasonally dynamic mosaic of baseline soil acidity. Among soil fertility indicators, pH responded most strongly. The mosaic of baseline acidity, actually modulated our treatment effect, and ERW may function primarily as a liming agent within some soils, and a liming agent and multi-nutrient fertilizer in others, specifically nutrient-poor tropical soils. Let's get into chapter 3. Does the chemistry of riparian soil and shallow groundwater pools signal lateral transport of weathering products? So we started to look within our riparian zone, first within the central riparian corridor. So I want to sort of show what this looks like. So you can see here, it was this wooded thicket in the center of this valley, and it's highlighted in pink. We had four fixed plots that we did repeated sampling and measurements on. These are the blue circles here. We added 4 additional, so we measured this once in spring 2023, then we applied and had 4 post-application sampling campaigns. We added an additional 4 soil samples in fall of 2024 to get an increased spatial coverage of our riparian zone. The other thing that's important to note is that we have not actually, no one has limed these fields in 20 years. So if we do see some indication of a liming-like event, then that could be attributable to our basalt amendment. Remember, we did not apply within our central riparian corridor. So after the application, we wanted to get more spatial coverage and potentially have other converging evidence of any kind of phenomena occurring within our central riparian corridor. Thus, we created,
It's in a bad spot.
Thus, we created the wooded riparian study area here, outlined in this white and this gold polygon. So we identified a potential opportunity where we could find agricultural effluent coming in from the western pasture that may be carrying with it alkalinity and these base cations. Now, we did not apply our amendment into the forest. So, if we potentially look at the bank-to-bank contrasts, maybe we would see some sort of geochemical indication of weathering products moving through these soils. This area is all under the same canopy, so it receives the same litter fall and has the same root architecture. The only difference is that this side is receiving treated agricultural effluent. And we know that actually because we took soil samples on both sides of the stream, and the side facing the pasture actually has much higher levels of extractable phosphorus, which is an indication of legacy phosphorus from manure and other products moving in from the pasture. Anything else I want to say about that? Okay, so we set up 4 different sampling positions, position 1, position 2, and this is on the side that is receiving agricultural runoff. We then have our stream that acts as a physical barrier, preventing weathering products from moving to position 3 and 4. And so what this will allow us to do is to look at basically the chemical profile, position 1 and 2, as well versus 3 and 4. But it will also allow us to look at the chemical gradient as we move closer to the stream. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. We were separated by 4 meters. We had 4 replicates on each riparian position. So we were looking again at topsoil 0 to 15 centimeter depth using a 1.59 centimeter core, 8 cores per sample. Same chemical analyses as chapter 2. We did set up linear mixed effects models that are much more simple than our previous chapter. Let's see. Okay, the last piece of evidence that we have, let me move this back, is this red circle here is a shallow groundwater well. It is the closest groundwater well to our central riparian corridor and the shallowest port, 1.3 meters deep. We filtered the samples through a 0.22 micron filter, and then they were analyzed for alkalinity by titration, and then calcium and aluminum were analyzed via mass spectrometry. Okay, where the data gets interesting is when we look at soil pH within our central riparian corridor. For those of you who don't know, soil pH is a master environmental variable within agricultural and riparian soils. So let's look at panel A. So the blue circle represents the mean of 4 independent observations. They are indicated by the dark gray circles, and then the error bars are the standard deviation. So you will see that after the application, because the application date is the dashed red line, you will see that pH moves from around 5.9, this is the mean pH, to maybe about 6.2, and then by spring 2024, it actually increased by 0.62 units from baseline. Now this was statistically significant with the linear mixed effects model, so this mean was statistically different from this mean. And the same with this mean. Now you will notice by fall 2024, there are 4 gray circles. These were the additional 4 sampling plots that we added to increase the spatial coverage of the central riparian corridor. And you will see that they also cluster around the other data points. Now, very interestingly, by spring 2025, we start to see the system relax back towards baseline chemistry. That's kind of interesting. Maybe what we're seeing is actually sort of a wave of weathering products moving through these soils, transiently changing the pH. And so, one way that you can describe this is with sort of a sigmoidal-like wave approaching the peak, and then a reverse sigmoidal wave moving back. So this pulsatile-like response that we're seeing is actually quite interesting, and that actually was predicted by a preprint by Jordan et al. Just came out a few weeks ago. So again, is this just an analog nature of pH, Well, we took it out of that, but in terms of proton activity, again, we see marked declines and then sort of this rebounding effect. Is there anything else I want to mention about this? Okay, moving forward. So let's look at base cations. So the first thing that we should think about is sort of the background ratio of these base cations. So you'll see that calcium is around 2,000 milligrams per kilograms or parts per million. Now, magnesium is about 20 times less within the exchange complex, around 75. Potassium is a little higher, around 100. And so as we move forward in time after the application, you will see that the mean with about 3 months after the application starts to increase, but then by spring 2024, it increases by 124%. Now that was statistically significant different from spring 2023, and then it releases back down, it relaxes back down to baseline by spring 2025. Now, what's happened here? So we have variable charge sites on soils that are probably opening up as this flood or this wave of base cations move into these surficial soils. Now, this is probably deprotonating these sites, and then these base cations are then absorbing onto these exchange sites and then being released through flushing. So water comes in with all of these solutes. The water then leaves the watershed. These solutes then get sort of retarded behind by being sorbed and desorbed on and off of these exchange sites, probably on organic matter and different clays within the riparian soil. Interestingly, these soils may be working much like a capacitor in electronics. So in a capacitor, you'll have two charge plates, one negative, one positive, that store a charge, okay? And much like that, on these exchange sites, you'll have sort of increased negative surface charges that can then bond with these increased positively charged base cations that are separated by the hydration sphere when you think about sort of the double layer of the cation exchange capacity. So in a sense, these soils are storing more charge and then releasing that back out. Now that has an interesting implication. And we're going to get into that implication, but I briefly want to touch on the remaining analytes. So magnesium and potassium went up, sodium did not. Sodium stayed relatively flat. And collectively, the effective cation exchange capacity pretty much mirrored calcium. Okay, so if we are storing base cations transiently on these exchange sites, then if we assume within the aqueous solution that these base cations are balanced by alkalinity, specifically bicarbonate, because within our stream water we have been able to tell that most of our base cations were balanced by bicarbonate. We could do an illustrative calculation. Let's put that there. Anyways, and so we can store up to 1.5 tons of CO2, or the equivalents from the charge that's being stored within these superficial riparian soils. And that is sort of within the area of that central riparian corridor within the upper 15 centimeters. Unfortunately, we did not depth resolve. We did not do depth resolve testing, so we do not know the entire storage capacity of these riparian soils. But if we look at the superficial layer, and we sort of normalize this by area, that's actually 10.11 tons of CO2 per hectare of charge of the CO2 CDR delay being sort of stored on these exchange sites. Okay.
I just live with it, Quinn.
Yeah, all right, we're going to live with it. So the other thing that we can think about is the ratios of base cations. So we see that the the calcium to magnesium ratio starts around maybe 16, 17, and then increases, and this is spring 2024 is statistically different from spring 2023, and then it falls back down to baseline by spring 2025. We also see an increase in calcium relative to potassium. So the ratio and chemical fingerprint of the amendment is sort of being detected within these soil samples. So remember that we did run this salt through our extractor, which has a weak acid, and we pulled out about 200 times more calcium than magnesium. So we should probably be seeing a shift more towards calcium than magnesium. Okay. If you're not convinced that we're seeing some sort of alkalinization effect within the riparian soils, let's go look at the wooded riparian study area. So I want to turn your attention to position 2 and 3. This is soil pH. Remember that positions 1 and 2 were receiving agricultural effluent, and positions 3 and 4 were not. So position 2 has a pH of 6.7, and then position, or about 6.6, 6.7, and then position 3 has a pH of about 6.1. Now that delta is about 0.5, 0.6 units. That is the same difference of before and after that we saw within our central riparian corridor. Now, one limitation of the study is that it is not necessarily a perfectly paired before-after control impact of bocce design, but we do have both a before and after component and both a spatial sort of control and treatment component that can create convergent multiple lines of evidence, and indeed, we are seeing some kind of alkalinization. So, okay, so we're seeing that this side has a much higher pH, and that is exactly what we would expect given a flood of alkaline products moving through these soils. We also see that that is repeated across seasons. So this was fall 2024, this is spring 2025. We see that this same signal is actually superseding any kind of potential seasonal variability. We also see this within calcium. We see that positions 2 and 3 on opposite sides of the bank are much different. Where I think this gets very interesting is not just thinking about the relative magnitude on each side of the stream, but the gradient leading up to the stream. So if we look at calcium on position 1 and 2, you will see that we have an increase as you move towards the stream. Now mind you, this is about 4 meters difference. So as we're moving towards the stream, calcium is increasing. Now that is indicating some kind of pooling effect. Now, if we look on the opposite side of the stream, you will see positions 3 and 4. It's kind of the opposite, isn't it? The closer you get to the stream from positions 4 to 3, the extractable calcium and pH go down. So what that makes me think is that on the side that was not receiving any treated effluent, that maybe we were having some kind of flushing that was carrying base cations out of these exchange sites into the stream, and then we had actually inverted that chemical gradient with our treatment to be more pooling dominated. Okay, the last line of evidence comes from a shallow groundwater well along the central riparian corridor. This is 1.3 meters deep. Alkalinity increased before versus after the application date. And so did calcium, dissolved calcium. And all meanwhile, groundwater remained relatively stable. We didn't see any systematic increase in groundwater. So we have over the course of this chapter, we have tried to think about potential things that could confound our signal and either try and explain them away or build other additional converging lines of evidence. So in conclusion, we saw a marked increase in pH within our central riparian corridor, about 3 times greater than within our agricultural soil, before partially relaxing back towards baseline. Extractable base cations occupied these exchange sites and then left, and there was sort of this inferred CDR delay, sort of this retardation of the signal downstream. Shallow groundwater alkalinity and dissolved calcium increased following the basalt application, while the water table depth remained relatively stable. Within our wooded riparian study area, we saw that the side receiving agricultural effluent had much higher pH and base cations and had actually inverted the gradient on the opposite side of the bank. Now there are some interesting implications to this. Riparian zones function as reactive interfaces and are actually storing these weathering products and then then releasing them later on. This could be part of CDR accounting frameworks, monitoring, reporting, and verifying, MRV is what they call it. Lastly, I think we need to do more investigation on this. I think that we should further isolate the riparian zone, that we should do depth resolved soil sampling, look at pore water through lysimeters. Okay, chapter 4. Does enhanced rock weathering alter metal liability in agricultural or riparian soils? So within our agricultural soils, we use the exact same experimental design and linear mixed effects modeling for soil. The one thing that was different is we started looking at vegetation. And we looked at positions 1, 3, 5, and 7, where we took three replicated quadrats, each half a meter by half a meter, and we air dried them, we weighed them, and we ground them with a weighing mill. And the idea was that we could estimate the forage, sort of before versus after. And so this was a perfectly paired bocce design. And we could also look at the metals within the plant. So we could look at, specifically this was done at Penn State, we could look at copper, manganese, zinc, and nickel. This was part of their standard agronomic test. This was digested with hydrochloric acid and hydrogen peroxide in heated pressurized containers. All right, so across hayfield and pasture soils, there was no consistent evidence of increased extractable metal risk, forage metal concentrations, or decreased yield following the basalt application. We ran our linear mixed effects models, and there was really no consistent change. Bolded values are. The other thing is that we compared these two agronomic recommendations from both University of Vermont for soil and Penn State University for forage. Again, these were well sort of within background levels and below any kind of potentially harmful level. Where it gets interesting is when we look at metal extractability versus pH. So it is well understood that as soil pH increases with an agronomic soil, metal lability, extractability go down. So the ability for plants to take up metals versus the availability for metal to leach into groundwater. So what we did is these were baseline soil extractability tests from a modified Morgan. One thing that is interesting to note is that the modified Morgan is actually a prime extractant for plant availability. It is advocated for by the McBride group out of Cornell. It's an ecotoxicological group, and they've been advocating this for about 2 decades. So we looked at nickel, lead, aluminum, zinc, manganese, copper, chromium, and cadmium. And within our agricultural soils, the 3 metals that responded most to increased pH were nickel, lead, and aluminum. These were statistically significant trends. And quite interestingly, we see that these are the 3 metals that were reduced within our central riparian corridor. So when we go to look at these, you will see that nickel, aluminum, and lead actually decreased by 59 to 79% a year after the application date. And that is statistically significant, that difference of means. And then what you'll see is that you start to get this sort of partial relaxation as these weathering products move out of the watershed. Now this is interesting because there are other studies such as the silicate addition at Hubbard Brook, where they have actually seen reductions in extractable aluminum over 27 years later. But we did not apply the amendment within these riparian soils. So what we're seeing is that calcium, alkalinity, other base cations are moving into these soils, reducing metallability. Perhaps you're seeing the formation of like maybe aluminum hydroxides or other metals. And we also see this within our wooded riparian study area. So we see that nickel, aluminum, and lead are much less on the side receiving agricultural effluent across seasons. And we also see this across other metals, including zinc and manganese as well. So we're having a pretty consistent signal of reductions of metallability within our riparian zone. One thing we can look at is actually the ratio of calcium to aluminum within a single sample. And so as extractable calcium goes up, extractable aluminum goes down. We actually see a 400% increase within this indicator. And so this ratio is an indicator of the ability for calcium to increase soil pH, which then reduces the lability of these metals. And aluminum is typically the most sensitive metal to pH changes. It is mostly because it's trivalent. It actually can be considered part of the acidity within exchangeability soil exchangeable acidity tests. Okay, so we see sort of this wave-like pattern that is pretty consistent with the other wave-like patterns that we see. Now let's look in the groundwater near that central riparian corridor. We see that dissolved aluminum goes down. And remember, we saw dissolved calcium go up. So together, that molar ratio also increases. This is the geochemical fingerprint from our basalt. Again, all meanwhile, the groundwater level remained relatively constant. So when we take a step back and we compare our results to others in the literature, what we'll find, so our study is the STAR, 20 tons per hectare, starting pH within our riparian soils of about 5.9. When we compare these to others within the literature, sort of independent of the application rate and starting pH, we start to see this pretty interesting broad trend. Desmales et al. And Bierling et al. 2024 both found declines in extractable nickel after their amendment. Now, what I did is I plotted extractable nickel versus the Bowen's reaction series or the Goldich weathering series, and that is sort of defined by the magnesium to silica ratio within those rocks. And so we see that there's sort of this threshold of about 0.3 units. Some of you in the audience may be kind of interested, if you're interested in something like phytomining, for example. If you move above a ratio of 0.3 magnesium to silica, you actually start to mobilize more metal in the soil than you sequester. And now there are some studies that have actually used pure olivine and have seen an increase in extractable nickel by about like 1,000%. Okay, is there anything else I want to say here? Okay, so broadly, to summarize our findings, there was no consistent increase in extractable trace metals in agricultural soil, no significant increase in plant tissue metals or reduction in forage yield. The central riparian corridor plots exhibited extractable nickel, aluminum, and lead declines by 59 to 79%. Soil and groundwater calcium to aluminum ratios increased following the salt application. So there are a couple of broad conclusions and implications. Pioneer Valley basalt did not pose a measurable environmental risk at agronomic rates. Basic feedstocks with low magnesium to silica ratios favor metal scavenging over mobilization. Now, I do want to pin down some of these mechanisms of metal sequestration. So as pH goes up, the adsorption strength goes up, and that can actually create stronger sorption for cationic metals. In addition, you may even find new precipitation of some metals like aluminum hydroxide or other oxyhydroxide metals, even say goethite. as one. You may even see the precipitation of clays, though that is, we don't really have a lot of evidence for that, and that is a pretty big claim. Okay, the last one is that ERW may have applications for potentially trace metal mobilization through accelerating the soil aging process. Now, in soils, if you have high levels of extractable metal, as soils naturally weather, those weathering products will sequester metal over a long period of time. This is actually pretty canonically understood in textbooks like Alloway et al. 2012. Okay, so some important takeaways and conclusions. So, basalt can function as an effective liming agent in well-buffered temperate agroecosystems. Initial soil acidity strongly controls pH response and agronomic benefits. Land use and topographic position create mosaics of baseline soil acidity, modifying the enhanced rock weathering effect sizes. There is convergent evidence of riparian zone alkalinization. We saw pH rise by 0.62 units a year after the application. We saw increases in extractable calcium and other base cations. We saw that we had actually inverted the spatial gradient of extractable calcium and pH, moving towards the stream. There are some interesting implications that we should try to further constrain the function of these riparian zones within watershed functioning in terms of enhanced rock weathering. And they are acting as reactive interfaces. Let's look at metals. To summarize these findings, there is no evidence of trace metal accumulation. Extractable metals went down within our central riparian corridor, and the feedstock composition mattered. Potentially, we might be able to use some of these silicate feedstocks to intentionally reduce soil metal layability, though that is for discussion. We could talk about that more in Q&A if anyone is interested. So, a concluding perspective, we tracked base cation signals from upslope soils and vegetation to riparian soils and shallow groundwater. We identified where chemical changes emerged in magnitude and the form across the watershed continuum. Future work should further constrain riparian storage, transformation, and export of weathering products. This study reflects a broader scientific shift toward understanding emergent behavior through system-scale experiments. And we can talk a little bit more about that point as well, that's very interesting. I do want to make a brief acknowledgement about the weight of the room that we're currently in. This house belonged to O.C. Marsh. He was the first professor of paleontology at Yale. He described and named the Triceratops in 1889 and left the house to start the Yale School of Forestry back in 1900, the first forestry school in the United States. I want to acknowledge the Sleepers River Research Watershed for the scientific foundation that this research was on. I also want to thank the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture and other institutions that helped fund this work. I would also like to thank the members of my committee, including Jim Sayers, Mark Bradford, and Peter Raymond, for their guidance, as well as these other institutions and collaborators. Thank you.
Questions for Quinn?
I was curious what the total potential of the tons of CO2 of rock per hectare was. Like, I was curious what the magnitude is that when you talk about like the 10 tons of CO2 per hectare that's potentially being stored. What's the total percentage of that relative to the total potential of the rock?
And that's a good question. So we cannot fully constrain that. We actually don't have a pretty good measurement of the actual dissolution of our feedstock. What this is not a direct CDR measurement. This is sort of, just for clarification, This is the equivalent of potential alkalinity generation of base cation stored within that upper 15 centimeters. So you're asking how it is sort of relative to the overall CDR of the project. We don't know, unfortunately.
Kind of to follow up on that, so like 10 tons per hectare, like this is just normalized to the area of the riparian zone? It's normalized to the whole?
So within our riparian zone, it was 0.66 hectares. That's a little over an acre for those of you that don't know. And so that was actually 1.5 tons within that 15 centimeters within that area. Basically divided by the area, that's what you get.
You spoke a little bit at the start about how the hill slope is kind of a model for the longer transition towards the ocean, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but in that it seems like a lot of the variables return to where they started after the period of the 2-year study. I'm wondering what that says about how often one would need to apply enhanced rock weathering to get the various effects you're looking for within a sort of this hill slope, and then also if that time period tells you anything about the fate of the carbon or the various ions after it leaves the field, in terms of what would happen as it moves towards the durable storage.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. So you're asking, what does this tell us about how often we can apply ERW and sort of maximize our carbon dioxide removal? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so that's one part, and then the other is, does the fact that it all returns to baseline, is that expected, and what does that sort of wave pattern you talked about, what does that mean more broadly, if anything?
So this is an interesting topic. So to answer your first question, the first part of your question, which is how often can you do this and what does this mean? So there are two things that are sort of emerging from ERW literature. There's sort of the transport limitation and then also the reaction limitation. Now, one thing one of my colleagues did is they found that we only weathered about, this was an estimation, this was not, so to answer your question, this was not a direct measurement of the actual dissolution, but based upon the alkalinity that came out of the stream, it was only within, I think it was like 13 to 17% of the total dissolution of the rock. But again, that was not a direct measurement. And so I think that there's this idea that you need soils to become more acidic in order to have your basalt feedstock dissolve. So if you keep because we're also adding acid neutralization capacity to the soil, right? As we add these feedstocks, as more acids get generated by different like roots and microbial processes, and base cation leaching, you will find that that will actually start to dissolve some of that application that remained undissolved before. So, the answer is that you'll probably be able to apply this in areas that tend to produce more acidity. So I think that it sort of matters a lot about the baseline conditions of your landscape. So this hill slope sort of shows us where, in areas where we have a lot of base cation leaching, those areas we may be able to apply more. So I think the other part of your question that I thought was very interesting is what does that wave-like pattern within our central riparian zone mean? That is basically tracking the weathering products moving through downslope through the central riparian zone and into the stream out towards export. So that is evidence that we are seeing real carbon dioxide removal happening.
In your introduction, very rightfully mentioned that it's crucial to understand not only the weathering in situ where we weather it, but also the export of weathering products to eventually reach the ocean where alkalinity would then be a long time stored. Right now that study was still very confined to this one weathering site, which is very understandable. Did you have, or do you have any idea of how much alkalinity and or DIC was exported via the stream in the middle of your experimental setup out of the weathering site and then to be further transported to a potentially longer storage?
I do know that there was a statistically significant change in alkalinity moving through the stream, that was detected. I don't know the magnitude, but I know the percent change. I know that it was, I believe, about 10 to 20% larger than background levels. So it was detectable, but I actually don't recall the magnitude because it's sort of out of bounds of the terrestrial ecosystem that I was studying.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious, just want to follow up on the wave signal, the wave-like signal that you showed earlier, and I want to ask a bit more. Do you think currently the basalt that's initially applied, is it still just slowly dissolving, or is the bulk of it already weathered and like the main signal is gone? Or are there other possibilities that just the salt pH increasing, just slowing down the whole solution? Which one do you think is more likely?
You're getting at a point that I actually find very interesting and actually something that needs to be looked at more, is sort of the what is dissolving within the feedstock. And so we have plagioclase, about 33% within our feedstock, and that is highly weatherable, it has a lot of calcium in it. So when we ran the acetic acid on the salt, we saw a lot of calcium get extracted. Now it seems to me that we actually weathered that plagioclase, releasing that calcium, but then a lot of these other minerals within, maybe like quartz and whatnot, were not actually able to be weathered. So it seems like we get this pulse of the rapidly weatherable material, and then other minerals seem to be more recalcitrant. Now, it's very interesting. There are other studies that have found, using the same Pioneer Valley basalt we did, they have seen equal parts of both magnesium and calcium within pore water and the extractable phase, but we didn't. What that may be due to, we're still not sure yet, is that we started at pretty mildly acidic soil. So perhaps we just weathered that very weatherable fraction of plagioclase that had a lot of calcium, but not the other minerals that contain more magnesium. It's sort of a leading hypothesis.
Anything else? Okay, let's thank Quinn.